Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
As Prime Minister Mark Carney wraps up his quiet Middle East trip, the noise back here at home grows louder. Canadians demanding answers for the lack of pressure on the United Arab Emirates for its hand in allegedly supplying arms to fuel the war in Sudan. This short trip, not very welcoming of media outlets, focused on igniting trade talks between the countries, fostering growth in AI initiatives and other investment sectors. But the violence in war-torn Sudan shifted focus from the Investment Protection Agreement, and as Carney now heads out for South Africa, the calls grow louder for Ottawa to step in and hold the UAE to account, regardless of the diplomacy and for hopes of foreign investment into Canada. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, we're talking to Glen McGregor, political correspondent for CityNews, to break down Carney's intentions behind his trip to the UAE and the growing pressure from Canadians and human rights groups alike to call out the country for what's happening in Sudan. Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's good to have you back.
Thanks for having me back.
So why is Mark Carney's visit to the UAE so significant, given it's the first by a Canadian Prime Minister since 1983?
Yeah, well, Carney is on kind of a worldwide tour trying to open up new trade opportunities to partially offset the effects of the United States tariffs on the Canadian economy. So he's been traveling to Asia, he's been traveling to Europe, and he's had some success in kind of opening things up a little bit. This trip, though, to the UAE, a little bit different because it's not so much a straight-up trade trip as it is more about drumming up investment, and mostly investment from the UAE into Canada. Currently, our trade relationship with the UAE is pretty small. I think $3.4 billion in 2024 in merchandise trade. That's two ways. So the amount of goods we send to them and they send back to us. So that is really small by world standard. And just as a comparison, we do more than that every day, even with the tariffs with the United States. So it's not a huge trade market for us. And the large reason for that is our major trade export, of course, is energy. It's oil and gas. And they don't need that in the UAE. They don't really, nowhere in the region do they actually need those kinds of products from Canada. So we have to look at things like agricultural products, and we do some trade in that currently right now. But it's really about going after those sovereign wealth funds. And a lot of countries in that region, including the UAE, have these enormous stockpiles of cash from oil revenues that they are looking to invest around the world, sort of diversify their holdings. And that makes them a good target for outreach from the Canadian side to get them to invest in projects in Canada. Of course, this is happening at a time when Canada really does need a lot of foreign investment to fund these so-called nation-building projects that Mark Carney intends to champion, again, as a way to reduce our economic dependency on the United States. So he set up this major projects office in Calgary, and he's rolled out two lists of projects that he intends to fast-track. And a lot of those projects really ultimately will need private sector investors to come forward and saying, okay, you guys have got the regulatory issues smoothed out. You've dealt with the indigenous communities. You've dealt with the various levels of government, provincial, municipal, to get these things underway. Now we need someone to come in and write a check to pay for it all. And look at the recent example, lots of discussion this week about possibly a new oil pipeline from Alberta, from the oil sands to northwest British Columbia, likely to Kitimat or to Prince Rupert, on sort of the same paths that they're already putting down natural gas pipelines. That is going to be a very expensive undertaking, multi-tens of billions of dollars, and it's kind of uncertain right now. Given the way oil futures look right now, people are not sure the price of oil is going to stay at the level it's at now, could actually go down in future. So getting private and sector investors to come forward and put up that kind of money to build a pipeline, committing to a technology that may be on its way out as we see increased adoption of electric vehicles, that's a challenge. But you go to somewhere like the UAE, obviously, they love the oil sector over there, and they might be more willing to put up that money. So that's really what Carney is looking at doing, is kind of shaking out some of the money out of these big pocket sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East and hoping to bring some of that money to Canada.
Right. You talked about the investments and his objectives there. What about the diplomacy of it all? Like him going there, shaking hands, showing face. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean that's what world leaders do, and we deal diplomatically with a lot of countries whose human rights records we're not crazy about. We may not have great relationships with. This is kind of a test of the relationship with China ultimately, because at a certain point, Carney is going to have to go over to China, and he's got the invitation from President Xi Jinping to do this at some point. He's going to have to go over there and talk to them about advancing our trade relationship, but there will invariably be questions about China's human rights record. And it's something that's been going on for a very long time. I remember like the Team Canada trips in the 1990s that Jean Chrétien led to China. That was always the issue. What about their record on human rights? Similar questions being raised with the UAE. Now, I should say, UAE's, the Amnesty International and other organizations like that, Human Rights Watch, have been critical of the lack of freedoms there in the UAE, but compares much more favorably than, say, Saudi Arabia, right, where you have regular beheadings of people on drug crimes. You still see real horrific abuses, clampdowns on people's personal freedoms. Some of that goes on in the UAE, and it's kind of interesting watching the coverage that some of our media colleagues have been doing from this trip, because we're not seeing a lot of them, and they don't have. I mean, usually when you go on a foreign trip, and I've been on a bunch of these with prime ministers, including Carney and Trudeau before, where you go over there and they're going to go in and meet with the leader that they're visiting. In this case, Carney meeting with the president of UAE, and usually you have something called a spray, where the television cameras come in. We shoot some pictures. The leaders might make a few comments. They shake hands. They smile. The flash bulbs go off. That's pretty standard on international diplomacy. You're not seeing that in the UAE, and that's because the UAE does not have a whole lot of commitment to press freedoms. So this is a very different kind of trip in that way. You're not getting that kind of freedom. And I think some of the Canadian journalists on that trip, I mean, I'm just sort of going by anecdotal communication when some of my friends of mine have be in touch, and it's not a great opportunity, not a great environment for them then to work in. But then there is, sort of the larger question of the UAE's human rights records, and a lot of criticism of that country. It's not super progressive. I mean, you look at sort of across the broader Middle East, we think of obviously Israel being very progressive on things like women's rights, and then you get into some of the Arab countries, including these essentially monarchies, even less freedoms. Jordan probably in that world is the most progressive. Saudi Arabia maybe at the other end or nearer the other end, and UAE somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Talking about human rights, a lot of human rights groups taking issue with this visit, calling on Carney to condemn the UAE for allegedly violating an arms embargo and sending weapons to Sudan. Of course, UAE denying these allegations. How has Carney responded to this so far?
Basically with silence, as far as I can tell. I haven't seen any statement from the prime minister. And keep me in mind, I'm not on the trip, not traveling with his delegation. I mean, quite often when a Canadian prime minister is traveling abroad looking to enhance the commercial relationships, he or she may be wary of discussing things like that at risk of sort of souring the communications. Now, there's generally been sort of a habit that prime ministers have been in where they know it's an issue, so they'll raise it in the bilateral meeting with the other leader. And I don't know if this has happened in this case in the last couple of days with UAE's president or any of its monarchy, but usually you just you say, okay, I'll bring it up. Listen, we're concerned about this, and I don't need a response from you necessarily, but I just let you know. In that meeting, that usually about a half an hour meeting, we're watching this, and we have some issues with it. And then afterwards, if they get questions from journalists, they can say, yes, we brought up the human rights issue. We brought up the situation, for example, in this case involving Sudan. I don't think that's happened yet. And I mean, I've been sort of monitoring the last couple of days since he arrived there. I haven't seen that. That's something that could come up kind of at the end of this trip. Usually, Carney likes to have a press conference at the end of a foreign trip. So that would be presumably in South Africa after the G20. and then he may talk about that then, but probably while he's in UAE, just to kind of maintain decorum, he's probably not going to bring it up. Now, you don't have to go as far as Donald Trump did the other day when he had the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, in the Oval Office, and he went on a lengthy defense of him, saying that the journalist that he has been credibly accused of contributing to the assassination or the murder of in Turkey, Khashoggi, saying that he was a controversial guy and a lot of people didn't like him, and this man here didn't do anything. I mean, that was preposterous. You don't need to do that because it was also contrary to, from some pretty established facts about that case. So, there's ways of handling that without kind of souring the negotiations on the economic or commercial front, and I expect that Carney's probably doing that.
What do you think, in the days to come, after the G20 Summit, what do you think human rights groups and Sudanese activists here in Canada are expecting from Ottawa in terms of a response? Do you think there's going to be an acknowledgement of any sort?
That's hard to say. And I mean, honestly, this is a pretty small community in Canada. I don't see a huge reaction to this. I mean, most Canadians probably are unaware of what's happening in Sudan right now. I mean, there's been a civil war going there for a couple of years now. It's a really awful situation. The allegations against UAE is that they are supplying arms to one of the militia groups, a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Force, and they have been accused of committing essentially atrocities. I mean, ethnic violence against other groups there in this fight and fighting against the Sudanese army. It's a messy situation, but as you say, UAE denies this. The allegation, more specific allegation, is that they've been shipments, regular aerial flights into neighboring Chad, which neighbors Sudan, and that's how the weapons are getting into Sudan, and that it's UAE money behind it. It's hard for us here to assess remotely whether that allegation is legitimate or not, but there's been enough reporting on it from credible organizations. They make you think that there's something to it, and certainly worth addressing for the Prime Minister while he's there.
Right. You talked a lot about how avoiding these kind of, humanitarian crises talks while on a trade trip or while on a trip to, advance investment, how those conversations can sour a potential deal. How do you think Canada can balance its push for foreign investment with this growing pressure to address allegations of UAE involvement? Do you think there's a balance that Carney can strike there?
I think there is, although he seems to be, almost completely single-mindedly pursuing enhanced commercial relationships with other countries and it seems to be less, at least outwardly, concerned about the human rights issues. And I think that's because essentially we're in a desperate situation right now. I mean, he has to move really quickly to start building these relationships. Today, they signed something called a FIPA. That is a Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement. And that could potentially lead a little further down the line to an actual free trade agreement, which could encompass or encapsulate some of those investment rules into that. And it's Carney's put out a press release today saying that he had discussions with the UAE president about having that negotiation towards, and they called it a CETA, which is basically the same name that they gave to the agreement between Canada and Europe that was signed a number of years ago. So sadly, it would be kind of modeled on that. But again, we get down to ultimately what kind of commercial benefits there could be from this deal. It's really kind of hard to say right now in terms of merchandise trade. It's not a huge trade market for us. They don't see us as an export market either. So that stuff is kind of secondary, I think, to the investment agreement, and possibly, something we could use as a model to take it to other countries in the region, other places that are sitting on these big sovereign wealth funds, and say, hey, come come bring your money, invest your money in here. This, foreign investment in Canada is a tricky issue. Like when we have a process, though, the foreign investment review process here, where the federal government looks at every one of these big major investments from outside the country and decides on a case-by-case basis whether to proceed with this. Something that was kind of bedeviled Stephen Harper when he was prime minister was he got a lot of flack for approving a Chinese investment in some of the oil sands companies. People thought that was a bad move given sort of the security concerns with China, also with the human rights concerns with China too. Ultimately, though, he did kind of tentatively agree to some of those investments because he thought overall it was within, and that's the parameter you use, is it just sort of in general, is there a net benefit to Canada from these kinds of agreements? And in that case he did. And I think if it came to it, if this trip actually results in tangible investments being made, it's one thing to say, okay, we've got an agreement on investments, we're both going to sign this FIPA deal, but it's another thing to actually get the money into the Canadian economy, identifying the projects that the Emiratis might want to be involved in, and then getting them to actually cut a check. It's not just as simple as signing an agreement that sort of lays out the principles. But I think that agreement, though, very clearly states that Canada is, of course, a rule of law country, and that's a big concern for investors who are looking to put their money into other countries. They want to make sure your economy is stable, and that you won't have something happen where like the government changes hands and the new government comes in and decides to nationalize the industry in which you've invested, and then your investment could be wiped away. So that's kind of what they want to know. They want to know their money's safe and that their economy is growing, and they're going to make more money off this. It's going to be a good deal for them too.
With this investment protection agreement being signed during this trip, what do you think any benefits could materialize out of this for Canadians in terms of, investments or things that, everyday Canadians could be seeing?
Yeah, if you can tap into those billions of dollars in those sovereign wealth funds to get them to fund some of these things. It'd be wonderful if the Emiratis said, hey, we really like this idea of your high-speed rail from Toronto to Montreal. We're going to put up $20 billion of our oil money to fund it. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's some things like that. Apparently, I'm not really too up to speed on some of what the UAE is exactly interested in. I think probably they're going to be less interested in energy projects simply because although they might have considerable experience with those, they're kind of good on that. They don't want to go looking for other countries to get into that. I think one thing they seem to be really keen on is artificial intelligence. And we know this is an industry that requires enormous capitalization. Right now, people building these data centers and buying chips. I mean, there's concern that there might be a bubble in this business, although the earnings report from NVIDIA yesterday, I think probably assuaged some of those fears folks might have. But that's an area where private equity is really looking towards, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. It's getting these funds, like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds from other countries to put up the money for those kinds of things. I mean, we'll see over the next months and years whether or not this actually pays off, whether they end up putting any money into an economy. But there's kind of a race on right now around the world to glom on to wealthy nations like UAE, like the Saudis, and get them to buy our products, but also to put money into our economy. And, we see here Donald Trump talking almost every day about how he scored something. I think his figure right now is $21 trillion in new foreign investment that he's secured for the United States. I mean, it's bunk. It's not true. $21 trillion is such an astronomically high number. It'll never be realized. That's almost the same size of the total U.S. economy. I think the U.S. economy the GDP somewhere around 30 trillion. So, I mean, it's ludicrous. But it shows you how important this is to political leaders right now, is they can go wealthier countries and get them to send their money into Canada or U.S.
Going back to Sudan, why do you think has Canada not joined the U.S. in declaring the situation in Sudan a genocide? What implications could follow from that?
I don't know. I think Canada has to be really careful about using that word genocide. And in the U.S. case, it seems to be a little bit more nuanced. It's unclear to me whether that's the official position of the Trump administration or if it's something coming from within the State Department. I don't think we like to to use those kind of words. I mean, that has been applied to that group that the UAE is funding, as they have been accused of that, of at least ethnic violence, ethnic cleansing, maybe within Sudan. I think Canada is more cautious about that, and maybe more cautious now under the Carney government than we were under the Justin Trudeau government. Right? I mean, Justin Trudeau ultimately said that that there had been a genocide against our Indigenous people here, a cultural genocide. So I think maybe there's a little more caution in using that kind of terminology.
Yeah. To kind of round us off, Glenn, touching on, Carney's, coming in as prime minister, and he's kind of, redirecting the party in terms of their identity. We're not as left as we were with Justin Trudeau. And, his moves now in, really prioritizing investment and securing that capital from, all these foreign investors. Do you think within, Carney's next steps to diversify our trade portfolio, do you think Canada runs the risk of undermining its reputation on human rights by prioritizing trade deals over accountability?
I think there's always that risk. Canada's reputation on the world stage as sort of a fair broker, a diplomat, has really declined. And hard to say when that decline began. There was a time when we were kind of like the leading actor in sort of brokering peace in the Middle East. Go back to Lester Pearson, they basically inventing peacekeeping. I think the first deployment of Canadian peacekeepers, I believe, was in Cyprus, basically keeping the Turks and Greeks from killing each other. So we used to have that reputation as being a global force, not just on the human rights issues, but also actually acting on this by deploying peacekeepers. And then there was, of course, the situation in Rwanda, where a Canadian was in charge of a UN force, and that went very badly. And peacekeeping is not really something that we see a lot being done a lot. And there's been discussion about whether or not in Ukraine there could be a role for Canadians if there is eventually some kind of a ceasefire leading to a more lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine, that possibly Canada could have a role in helping maintain that peace, potentially by deploying peacekeeping troops there. That's something we've done in the past. It wasn't that long ago that we had troops in Ukraine helping train the Ukrainian forces. I went there once, I think it was back in 2016. I went there and saw Canadian troops training in Lviv, in the western part of the country. So it's possible that might be something we have a role again. We're nervous about doing it, though, because especially in places like Sudan, I don't think we'd send peacekeepers into there, especially given the experience in Rwanda. That's a really dangerous situation. Similarly, Haiti, absolute mess. A lot of pressure from the Americans for us to get more involved in that situation. And send in police and or the military there. Justin Trudeau was not interested in doing that. And I don't see Carney interested in either, because, anytime you do one of those things, you have to really be certain it is the right decision. And because one of the consequences, and we know this from Afghanistan, is you're going to get body back. It's coming back in the other direction. It's dead Canadians. And that is a very steep price for any country to pay. And it's a steep price politically for any government to pay. Do you really want to be taking that line? Now, that's not to say, though, that you can't be more critical of countries like UAE or Saudi Arabia for their human rights records. And I think we've done that, at the United Nations. Maybe we're not going so far as calling it a genocide yet. And I think there's good reasons why we may have held back on applying that designation. That could come later. But I think it's certainly not a region where at this point, there's any discussion about getting more involved in it.
All right, Glen McGregor, political correspondent for CityNews. Thank you so much for your analysis on this.
Thanks, Maria.
And that was the big story. We'd love to hear your And that was the big story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. If you have any, please reach out to us by email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or find us on X @thebigstoryfpn. If you think a friend or a family member might find this interesting, be sure to share it with them, and don't forget to leave a comment. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.